All right, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the American Library in Paris's virtual Evenings with an Author program. Tonight, we're joined by guest Mark Braude. So I'll just start by saying a little bit about the American Library. We are the largest English language lending library on the continent, something we're very proud of. And we're also 100 years old. So we've been celebrating our centennial in confinement, or sort of slowly deconfining here, but doing most of our programs continue to be virtual, and that's sort of not the way that we had anticipated celebrating our centennial, but we've been really glad that our wonderful community has come together, you know, donors, volunteers, our staff members. Obviously, it's been sort of an uplifting time despite some of the circumstances. And one of the exciting things that we've sort of had to do in this time is, of course, bring you our programs virtually. So we've been doing these virtual evenings with an author now for a couple of months, I think, and they've been tremendously successful. So I'm really glad that you guys are still continuing to tune in, and I hope you'd enjoy tonight. Oh, and also just to remind you, you can find out more about other programs on our Facebook page or on our homepage, and continue to read in eLibris, which is our virtual newsletter. Okay, just letting the last few people in the door here. All right, so as I said, we're joined tonight by Mark Braude. In addition to having written The Invisible Emperor, which I'll hold up for you guys here. It's always nice to see the book cover, I think. So the full title is The Invisible Emperor, Napoleon on Elba, From Escape to Exile. He's also the author of Making Monte Carlo, A History of Speculation and Spectacle. He's currently working on a narrative nonfiction work of the French artist and model Kiki de Montparnasse, focused on her professional and romantic entanglement with the American photographer Man Ray. So this is set in 1920s Paris. Okay, a couple more people coming in. And we will actually have the chance to hear about that project in greater detail very soon, I hope. So Mark was actually selected as the American Library in Paris Visiting Fellow, and he should have been with us last month, the month of May. It would have been wonderful, but here you have him tonight, so that's sort of our consolation prize. And of course, he will be joining us at the library in person just as soon as we're sort of able to plan that trip and envision how we go about re-entering sort of the normal world, the post-COVID world. We're very hopeful that that will be a wonderful visit, and you'll hear from Mark about that book, and he'll also be giving a writing workshop during his stay, so you can look forward to that. I should also mention that Mark has his PhD from the University of Southern California, and we'll see if he wants to tell us a bit about that and where his some of his interest for, I guess that was more his first book, so we'll see if he wants to get into that. Anyway, so I guess that Mark will just begin by sort of informally here by asking you how you are and where you are, and how confinement has been for you.
Oh, thanks for asking. I'm coming to you from Vancouver, British Columbia, where it's early morning and has continuing to rain through the summer here. Confinement, you know, glad to report nothing too extraordinary about my confinement. We have our chief health officer here, Dr. Bonnie Henry, has a motto. She says, now's the time to be kind, be calm, and be safe. And so that's just what we're trying to do is, you know, kind of just stay calm and safe and kind. And I'll try to do the same for the interview as well. But no, it's all good here in Vancouver. Thank you. And also I can kind of see some faces, the setup I have, and it's lovely to, this is definitely the most people I've seen in one place in a long, long time. And I thank you so much for that privilege. It's really lovely to see you all. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. It's wonderful what Zoom can do. It sort of can feel awkward to talk to yourself in the room, but at the same time, you can rest assured that we have people tuning in from couches and different sorts of kitchens, maybe all across the US, France, and Europe. I took a little survey about people who were registered for the event, so we've got people tuning in from all over the world, which is fantastic. So for those of us who haven't read the book, I just finished it last month, and I should start by saying that I really, really enjoyed it. I thought it was a tremendous book, and I should also mention that it is beloved in our community because it was a coup de coeur for the book award last year, the 2019 American Library in Paris Book Award. So congratulations again on that honor. But again, for those of us who haven't read it, I was hoping that you could sort of give us the short elevator pitch. So what is the book about? What were some of your takeaways? And maybe just open the scene for us. So how does Napoleon end up on Elba? And I'm already getting long-winded, but I'll let you take it away.
So it's a work of narrative nonfiction that considers a year in Napoleon's life. And I meant it for, I hope that it will be a book for people who might have no interest in Napoleon whatsoever, because it's really trying to be a story about other things, about family, about exile, about the negotiations between sort of power and personal demons. And so, as I said, it's this year in Napoleon's life. It's 1814 to 1815. And we open with Napoleon is at the head of an empire that essentially he's ruling about 80 million people. He gets defeated by this coalition of forces after about a quarter century of warfare in Europe. They send him to Elba, where he spends 10 months in exile. He then escapes, returns to France with about 1,000 people in tow, lands in the south of the country, and marches to Paris, and somehow, without firing a shot, retakes the throne. After which he is defeated again at the famous Waterloo, and they send him to St. Helena, and that exile sticks. So in the standard, there are literally hundreds of thousands of books about Napoleon and his era. And in those books, this little Elban chapter, those 10 months that I mentioned, tend to garner about, a couple paragraphs, maybe a page or two if we're lucky. And that's because I think, people, the majority of people who are writing about Napoleon find those other two events, the bookends that I had mentioned, far more dynamic, far more interesting, and far more important. This idea of a big military defeat and then this miraculous return. And my idea is to say, actually, those are less interesting to me than these 10 months on Elba, where he, it seems that he is not doing anything because he's not doing any major amount of ordering, killing, or dying. It's not a military part of his life. And I find that the most interesting thing to look at. I wanted to know more about those 10 months because, of course, something had to have happened. And we're just the sheer setup of this person who had gone from ruling 80 million to overseeing this tiny island of 12,000 was very interesting to me. And I thought it might shed some light on Napoleon as a person and also on this era more widely. So I don't know, I guess that was a very long elevator ride, maybe to top of the Empire State. Maybe that would have worked. I don't know, but
it was a perfect elevator.
That's about as short as I can get.
Yeah. And I wondered if you could take us back then to sort of the genesis of the book. I mean, you've already said that you were very interested in the concept of exile and escape as kind of your angle into this book, and that, it may be foolish to sort of try to write an entire biography or something about Napoleon when that's not really your background. So I guess just how did you come to that topic? And were you first intrigued by perhaps other exiles or just the concept of exile? Or what was it about these two so the connection of Napoleon, specifically the first exile, that really brought the book to life?
Great. And that's exactly it. It was that connection of this person in that exact moment where I wanted to meet with him. You mentioned that I had the PhD, and that was in modern European history, but a lot of French history, and also a very sharp focus on the visual culture. So looking at images not as just things that reflect history, but shape history. So borrowing a little bit from art history, but I was really interested in the image world and the visual world in my studies. Mm-hmm. And so as a student of French history, you hear about Napoleon a lot. I'd never thought in a million years I would write a book about him, but certainly it was somebody who loomed large in my studies. But that little Elban story always struck me because of, as I said, the kind of comedy of it. I just thought it was a weird setup and I wanted to know more. And I had it sort of in the back of my mind as something I wanted to read about. And there weren't actually, there was a book, like an academic book from 40 years ago that sort of had a dry, account of the details within a larger work. Anyway, so that was in the back of my head. And I wrote my first book about Monte Carlo, about the history of the casino resort there. And I was doing a postdoc at Stanford and living in San Francisco, right in the heart of the city. This is like 2014, 2015. And I would take the train from San Francisco to Palo Alto. And, you know, I felt very lucky to live there, and I feel in retrospect very lucky to have lived there. But definitely, aside from my wonderful colleagues and my friends, I felt a little bit out of step with the ethos of both that city and that campus. You know, I would hear on the train especially, which is where I was doing my thinking because I wasn't teaching and I wasn't at home, a lot of talk about data, you know, terabytes of data, making lots of money in startup culture. And which is not just to denigrate those things at all, but it just, I felt so out of step with that. And so, you know, you might call that alienation or a sense of, you know, not to be too self-indulgent, but a sense of being out of place. And I think in retrospect, that's why this story of exile kind of resonated with me and came back to the front of my mind when I was looking for the next project. I thought this idea of somebody out of place at this really intense scale, far more intense than anything I would feel, surely there must be something there. And so I wanted to look at that moment, and I kind of was, you know, towing the line of the archives and starting to read and get to know more about it. And it became more and more fascinating as I learned kind of the constellations of relationships on this little island, the locals, Napoleon's family, which we can get into all of that. But the third thing that sort of sealed the deal for me is that we're now into 2015, 2016, and this sort of global political crisis, we can call it, was starting to rear its head. And I started to think a lot about power and about political charisma, how people gain power, especially in ways that are tied to willful inscrutability, let's say. This idea of putting out a message that really doesn't say anything, but is very appealing. You know, it's not forceful. People buy into it very willingly, but it sort of relies on a sort of sense of emptiness or mystique, if you will. And I hope that's not too abstract, but that's kind of, I started to think maybe there was something there in the exile about Napoleon being off stage, being out of sight, that might explain or help to explain how he was able to pull off this miraculous return in 1815. So that's kind of the title Invisible Emperor, is this idea of somebody who is at the height of political and military power, and playing with that slippage between being highly visible and then now out of sight, supposedly out of sight on Elba. And did he end up trading on that? And did that in fact help his career in some ways?
Absolutely. And you're sort of talking yourself right into my next question, which is fantastic. So I thought this was a book about exile. It was about its ups and downs, its organization, sort of the nitty gritty of who goes where, how we organize this. And there are two ways that you sort of abstractly conceptualize of exile. And I think the first is exile as punishment, as it was sort of intended to be, and then exile as opportunity, which you've just been speaking a bit about. I wondered if we could just talk about the first point briefly again. So just very basically, sort of how was this exile for Napoleon? What did it do for his mental health, for his physical health? Who was he surrounded by? Just let's set the scene a little bit more.
So Napoleon at this point was in his mid-40s. He was very physically unwell. The whole defeat had taken its toll on him, and there's a very good chance that he attempted suicide right before he was sent off to Elba from his palace in France. The idea with exile, of course, is it's almost an insult. It's we're not going to execute you, but we're going to try and make you this banishment, this shame, that you will live out your days in shame. And I think that why I liked this particular exile rather than the last one, where he was on St. Helena for several years until he died, was that message didn't sink in with him. So while he was on this small Tuscan island, there's a sense at play, and I was never quite sure where he stood, because he dissimulates and he's very tricky with what he says. About, was he resigned? He kept saying, like, I'm going to retire here, I'm happy here, or was he planning an escape? And that was always the sort of balance driving the narrative. So there, the setup was, he's called the Emperor of Elba. He's given full dominion over this island. It's about the size of Staten Island. I think it's about 100 square miles. There's 12,000 people living there, who obviously have no say in the fact that one day they wake up and there's Napoleon Bonaparte getting off a ship. news hasn't obviously traveled to them, but he shows up and takes over, and he already has a new flag made that he designed on the way over. And then informally, there is this Scottish colonel, a young guy named Neil Campbell, who's the sort of de facto warden of this island. He doesn't have any particular power. He's actually there as Napoleon's guest, strangely enough, in an official capacity. But he's the Allied representative. He's reporting back on what is going on and meant to kind of enforce this jail term, if you will. And luckily for us, he kept a very detailed diary. And so a lot of the book concentrates on that relationship between the two of them, which is a sort of frenemy, weird.
Yeah, it's wonderfully ambiguous. That was one of the delights of the book, I think.
It's a bit of a cat and mouse, because he's obviously in awe of of Napoleon Bonaparte, who's the most famous military man of his age, but also, has personal animosity. Napoleon, this Campbell's brother had died fighting the French, and obviously, this is his number one enemy in life, in a sense. And here they are in close quarters. So that's one aspect of the exile. I'll talk about two more aspects, and then I'll wrap up. But the other thing I wanted to focus on was Napoleon and his family, which I mentioned. So his family was allowed to visit him, although none did, save for his mother and his sister. And they lived in this little villa, and they played cards, and they went for carriage rides, and it was quite delightful to watch them interact. The other thing that happens that I keep in play during the book is that his young wife, Napoleon's young wife, his second wife, and their child are always meant to come. And there's quite a bit of heartache that he thinks they're going to come, and they never do. And the question there is whether Napoleon's young wife, Marie-Louise, ever actually wanted to come, or whether she had her own agenda that had nothing to do with Napoleon. And then the third aspect of this very long answer is the Elbans themselves. I wanted to know what it felt like on the ground to have this, the most famous person on the globe come to be in charge of you. And these are fishing people, mining people. It's a fairly poor part of the world, and it's quite a bit of incongruity there. And Napoleon's trying to kind of subjugate them, but also make them love him. And that's really why I stuck with this project and why I loved it, is that I think it's the one time in Napoleon's life where he's seen by more people at closer range than at any other point in his life. And he'd seen more of the world than probably anybody of his time. And yet here we are, have him in this very intimate close-up view. And people write about it. People kept diaries, which I drew on.
Absolutely. And so this sense of sort of getting to be, finally known in some sort of normal way. Just as a person who, can walk out every day and interact with people who aren't necessarily in his sort of entourage. Do you think that shaped him as a person or as a leader, or what do you think the long-lasting effect of that may have been?
I think that it was frustrating above all. I think that, and again, I think that's why there's this mix of comedy and pathos with this moment of it never quite sunk in that this wasn't Paris and the height of empire. He would go around the island and just find properties and point them out, and then they would be his, and he would go and work at renovating them. There was a mine, he commandeered the mine, and decided to cut down on how much they paid and fed the miners, which led to revolts. All these things that he was sort of used to doing on a grand scale didn't quite work. And I think that in terms of shaping him, perhaps that frustration combined with this family heartache is what drove him to want to return, which was so stupid and so unexpected. There was nobody of rational mind who thought that Napoleon, after this round, huge defeat, would want to leave. He was lucky to have escaped with his life. Elba is a lovely place. He didn't have the support. It was so quixotic for him to try and return. And I think that was, that happened on Elba because of this frustration. Right.
And so as far as those who did remain in Europe, perhaps in power or otherwise, we've talked a lot about what you think those who were on Elba with him thought of him, or sort of his behavior directly towards them. But what role did his absence play in sort of shaping who he was conceived of by his contemporaries who were still in Europe?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that.
Mainland Europe, I should say.
No, that's perfect.
Continental Europe.
I'm glad you asked, because that's another huge part of the book that I didn't really mention, was what's going on in France, especially, and in the rest of Europe.
Yes.
And we've got the Congress of Vienna, this huge gathering of politicians to redraw the map in the wake of Napoleon. And my point, the point I try to make there about what's going on in France is that it's not as exciting as things were under Napoleon. And that's a problem for people. So that this, without getting too much into the nitty gritty, there's a Bourbon king who gets restored. There's a return to order. This Louis the 18th is in charge, but he's not dynamic. He doesn't have a really good story to tell. So people are happy that they're not, actively fighting in war, but they're a little bored. They're a little restless. There's not a sense of what the world means to them anymore. Whereas at least Napoleon, there was something there that some people could rally behind, not everyone. And so I think that was that absence of a story in France again helped to sort of benefit Napoleon, who was saying nothing. And again, this idea of the power of going away, the power of being in the shadows, it made for a good story. The hero brought low. So it's very difficult to track public opinion at this time. We're talking 200 years ago. You can look at taverns and the songs that people sang, what the police were looking for in terms of what they were worried about, what they were trying to censor. There's certain ways of getting at it. But it doesn't look like Napoleon had like this resounding, huge support, people being desperate to bring him back. But I think that when he did come back, there was at least a very momentary sense of excitement, of possibility, that this could at least be a sense of greatness for France, and a sense of sort of excitement, to everyone's detriment, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of, it's a very kind of romantic story and very exciting escape, and all of these elements may have worked to sort of elevate him and just shape the way that people viewed him in sort of an idealized way in some sense. I thought that was really interesting. And I wondered, as you said, we're looking back 200 years later, whether you ran into anything that helped you understand how that first exile may have shaped his legacy today.
Yeah, there's a sense that the exile itself, as I said, has been largely overlooked, but the return, this 100 days, right? It's called the 100 days. He marches this lightning march from the south of France. It's very dramatic. He sort of has this ragtag group that has come with him from the islands. Some of them are islanders. Some of them are courtiers who have come with him from France. The assumption is that they're going to get killed as soon as they touch French soil. And it's almost like a suicide mission. And then, strangely enough, they encounter this regiment of French soldiers, and a very dramatic scene happens where Napoleon walks out in front of this, these dozens and dozens of rows of soldiers, and opens his big coat, and he says, "Here I am. I'm your emperor. Do with me what you will." And somebody calls fire, but nobody fires. They all throw down their guns, and this actually happened. And they sort of, both sides embrace, and then from then on, he has the sort of army behind him. And it's actually, I think, one of the closing scenes of the book toward the end, because that's the turning point. That's this idea for a short little while that now we're back in the Napoleonic era once again. And that, historians will argue, because a lot of work has been done on this period, historians will argue really sealed Napoleon's legend. Why people there are people, we're the horror and destruction and widespread warfare are one thing, but that this idea of why Napoleon is a popular a character of popular fascination really started to grow with this return from Elba, because of its unlikeliness, because of its strangeness, and because it was for a time effective.
Yeah, great. I did want to turn to talk about Napoleon's escape, because I think for some reason I entered, reading the book, and I figured we'd hear so much more about exile than escape. And it's true that the focus seems to be more on the exile. And I loved that you were able to do that, because for me, the pacing was really successful. So it's not just about rushing through this sort of boring period, because as you show us, there was nothing boring about the exile, but you do get to the escape, and it's quite a story. It's very much an adventure for Napoleon and the people who were involved in that, and also the people who were trying to track him down, successfully or not. So I wondered if you could elaborate on how you sort of controlled the pace of the story. You knew this very specific period of time that you wanted to focus on. How did you manage not to sort of rush through that, and then also to give enough time and kind of let the emotion play out of each phase of this story?
Sure. So there's, it's the blessing of writing history is that you can't lie, right? You're beholden to the truth. You have to just you can't make stuff up. So did it happen or did it not happen? And so there's a sense of chronology. Mm-hmm. That was guiding me. I always had the events in my mind, but we all think in terms of narrative, in terms of story. Events happen to us, and then we give them order by some sort of story, shape of story. And there are certain genres that the horror story, the love story. I had, luckily, the jailbreak story, which is a very tried and true genre. And this, without over-determining or lying, I could shape the material I had to fit in with the genre of the jailbreak story, which is, person gets busted, person goes to jail, it's tough, they adapt, they make some friends, whatever, and then they bust out of jail, right? And that's the climax. And then the down ending is they get caught again or they get killed, and the up ending is they run off to Mexico, like in Shawshank Redemption, I think is how that ends, if I'm correct, or they have riches or whatever happens to them. So I had that sort of three act genre. The writer George Saunders has this great line about stories are just send a guy up a tree, throw rocks at him, and bring him down. That's every story of his, he says. And I think that was this is what we did to Napoleon without trying to as I said, over-determine or shape the story in a false way, but I had that. And then the second genre I had, or it's not really a genre, I was really lucky. And anyone who writes in the audience might have felt this or done any creative act, is that everything you see around you starts to somehow inform or resonate with your work. And so everything I was reading at the time, I was like, that's totally directly connected to this story 200 years ago. And so I read this, or I was luckily just happened upon this Fellini movie, Amarcord. I think I'm probably mispronouncing it, but it's this, it's set in a sort of rural setting in under fascism. And what's lovely about that movie is that a lot of things change, and it's a tremendously charged political moment, but underlying it all are these very steep structures of agrarian life that just keep going. And certain things that are tied to the season. There's a season for harvesting, there's a season for planting, there's a season for serenading people in the fields and parties, certain parties. And so all those things continue despite all of this political change. And I think that's true of life. And I think that reminded me that in this story, this very dynamic story, I also had to be mindful of the deeper underlying things that would stay the same. So while I had this kind of very dramatic 3-act arc, I could also point to things, especially about life on Elba, that remain the same. So for instance, again, a really direct corollary is I found that right a week before Napoleon showed up, there was this kind of a local custom where the unmarried men would serenade the unmarried women from village to village with mandolins and sing. And that happened a week before Napoleon left, and then shortly after, or arrived, and then shortly after he left, they did it again. So it's like, here's this most dramatic event you could possibly imagine in Elban life, and then yet sort of life goes on as well. So those
right, the rituals remain.
Right. So that's kind of what helped me shape the story in the way that I did.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, that was such a generous response. Also, I feel like I could have asked you, why are you writing the genre of literary fiction? And we have our answer right there with the way that you're sort of incorporating different inspiration from obviously the historical events, but also popular culture and other literary figures. I mean, yeah, thank you for that. I thought we might turn and talk about the research process too, because we've sort of gotten into the idea of influences and inspiration and the narrative of the story. But I mean, what was it like to embark on research for this project? Did you travel a great deal? Were there archives? Was much of the correspondence digitized, or sort of how did that all work?
Yeah, luckily with when talking about Napoleon, there's an embarrassment of riches,
Yeah.
both in primary, firsthand accounts and the secondary literature, other historians and scholars writing about him and his entourage, and some great books in the last generation or so that are starting to actually care about people who are in his, satellite members of his entourage, and especially, for instance, was a great book about Marie Louise, the second wife, which was incredibly valuable to me, and then I could sort of hunt down those sources, look at the footnotes of that book, and go see, well, where was this author looking? So everywhere kind of led to somewhere else. As far as the nitty gritty of where they were, certainly the Central Library in Paris, the National Library of France, was incredibly valuable, as was, I had the good fortune to be at Stanford at that time, and Stanford has a tremendous French history collection and a wonderful librarian of French history. And then finally Elba. Elba, my Italian was sort of rudimentary, and the best use of my time on Elba was just walking around, because so much of it still, looks the way with varying degrees, the trees, the layout of the geography. And it's so and so my wife and I lived there for a month or two, and it was lovely, but also very helpful in getting the scale of things. I have a line in the book, something about, Napoleon could smell the fish frying from his neighbor's yard, which was so new to him, and that's from kind of standing exactly in Napoleon's bedroom and being able to smell frying fish, because I was like, well, and I could hear like the clinking of people's dishes, and there, that embodiment of that moment, I thought, well, how bizarre that must have felt for somebody who's always been at such a distance from the common people, and something that I could not have gotten without walking those steps.
Yeah, I can definitely imagine that. My own research focused on Cyprus before I began at the library, and so I really share that experience of actually going to the island and realizing how important it is to map things out and the different sites. And there's just a whole part of the book, I guess, you never would have really been able to connect with and tell the story correctly unless you had sort of walked in Napoleon's footsteps, as they say.
And islands are inherently cool. There's just something
They're very cool. They're the best.
Yeah.
And I think you hint maybe at the very end, or the acknowledgements, I can't remember, when you do mention sort of contemporary Elba and what it's like today, and that there's sort of silly souvenirs of Napoleon and this and that. What can we expect to find with Napoleon's face on it if we do go to Elba?
Right. So there's Napoleon soap, there's Napoleon beer. That's in the main town of Portoferraio. Elba, if and when anyone is able to get there, is absolutely, my view is a superficial tourist's view, of course, but I have only the most wonderful things to say about it. It's gorgeous. It's being an island surrounded, you have numerous beaches. People were warm, the food was good, and then you're in Tuscany. It's kind of weird. This is the north of Italy, and because of Napoleon's brief time there, the infrastructure is actually quite a step above a lot of the rest of that part of the world. The roads are fantastic, and everything's sort of been set up because of the foundations laid by the people there during this year. There was a lot of public work being done because of, again, this sort of Napoleon's energy, needing to put people to work and projects to keep him busy, all kind of went into public works. And so the people you know, despite what one might think about Napoleon, this is one of the positives we could say of his time there, was that it is an absolutely lovely place.
Great. And I have to ask you one tough question, so I hope you're ready for this one. That's the game here. So obviously this, you know, this interview is playing out in the context of confinement in the fight against COVID. And I also found it kind of strange to read a book about exile while I was still partially confined. You wrote the book before the pandemic, and I wondered if you had any thoughts as to how writing it may have sort of prepared you for confinement in a way, or sort of the reverse of that, if any of the lessons you've had from your own confinement have helped you better understand Napoleon and his exile, perhaps.
Yeah, I've kind of been cautious about, you know, I don't want to be glib and say one is perfectly analogous. And I'm not suggesting that you were saying that either, but you know, this is always the tricky question for a historian, is you love when what you're writing about resonates with the present, but you know, you don't want to be too simplistic about it. And that's and so I feel like it exists in this little vacuum, and I don't, you know, I tried leafing through a few pages of the book a couple of days ago just to kind of refresh myself, because it's been a few years, and it's like, it's so strange to me. It's like somebody else wrote that book that I don't know, you know, and so I don't know that I could revisit it with any fresh eyes and do anything worthwhile. But I would say, again, without sort of trying to, you know, make Napoleon warm and fuzzy, I was impressed, let's say, by his energies and what he would do in a day. You know, he would wake up and write like 30 laws that are so arcane, because that was just what he did. Like, this is what we're going to feed the dogs. This is what time we're going to raise the flag. This is how people are going to march. And then he would go like on a horseback ride for 4 hours to go look at a mine, and then he would go climb a mountain. And this is a guy who was not in great shape at this point. And then he would go like row, you know, a boat out to go survey some defenses. And then he would, as I said, you know, he had his sister and his mother, and they would play cards, and there would be meals, and there would be just a very, very full day, despite of or because of being in a very, you know, confined and difficult situation. So I guess if there's anything I could kind of take out, was like, well, I think I can, you know, I can manage to do whatever small things I do in my day. There was that sort of sense of you know, putting it those in conversation with, here's somebody 200 years ago who did so much more in a day than I'll do in a month.
Right. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. I was also very sort of hyper aware of each 24 hours, each sort of, you know, each day was very distinct and very important to fill in our own particular way, you know, do what we could in confinement when we had such limited experience and we're experiencing isolation as well. So thank you for being game to answer that question. So it looks like we already have audience questions rolling in, which is great. And I do invite you, any of you in the audience, to begin submitting via the chat feature your questions for Mark below. And before we get to those, I did want to ask if you had maybe a preferred bookseller in either North America or in Europe or in France. You know, where can we order the book, importantly?
Well, my France answer is such a cliche, which is Shakespeare and Company, which is, I think, the platonic ideal of a bookstore, and I just like the greatest place on earth. In the States, there's a great service called IndieBound, which people might be familiar with, IndieBound. I don't know if it's .com or .net or .org, where you can sort of, the independent bookstores, you type in what you want and it'll find it in your area, and you can support your local. I don't know if it's in Canada. So yeah, I would say, you know, independent bookstores, libraries. Let's, you know, I think it's important to support them as we can.
Thank you. Yes. Okay, so I'll go ahead and start with the audience questions then. Thank you for the conversation, Mark, first of all.
Thank you.
So Sarah is wondering, for N. Campbell, for N. Campbell, what was the percentage of respect versus contempt he felt toward Napoleon?
That's great. So Neil Campbell, you know, this really strange figure. I think we have to understand, so this is the guy that I said, you know, was the de facto warden. His assignment is so bizarre. He's sort of told to go there. He's not really given, this is by the British foreign minister, on this clandestine mission. No one's gonna know that he really did anything. It's not for glory, it's just for kind of service. And he's never really clear of his position. So I think that bred a certain amount of contempt going in of like, why am I here? You know, what's the point? Besides, you know, somebody who had been raised his entire life to sort of see Napoleon as the #1 enemy of the globe, showing up there. So I think that contempt to begin with, and then strangely enough, or maybe not strangely enough, because Napoleon was legendarily charismatic, very quickly gets drawn in. And you can see the language in his diary shift in subtle ways, where he starts to feel like they are friends. And they will spend these like long nights by the fire after a big meal with some wine, and Napoleon will declaim, he will sort of start talking about past victories and saying, here's where the British beat me, and here's where you were smart, and here's where you were wrong. And, you know, is he doing it because he just is bored and wants to show off? Or is he doing it to seduce Campbell? I don't know, right? But it's that tricky interplay. So percentage-wise, very hard to kind of give you a very strict mathematical percentage, but I would say that the question is apt, because that's one of the big mysteries of this moment, of this flow from outright contempt to a sort of, I wouldn't say love, but a very, an intimacy, a closeness. And it ends up with, I don't think I have to worry about spoiler alerts with this book, because it's the kind of, you know, we know how it ends. Napoleon escapes. Campbell is ruined in terms of, because it does get out that he was the kind of guy who should have been watching the store, and he was actually out on the mainland visiting his girlfriend when Napoleon escaped. Whether in collusion or not became a question. I don't think he was. I think it was just kind of carelessness, but it sort of ruined him. And he ended up kind of living his own life in exile from that, had to kind of leave England. So great question, thank you.
Yeah, the next question is from Jennifer, and she says, I think it's fascinating that you applied a fictional genre, so the jailbreak story, to a nonfiction historical book. Did that inform your thinking in the research phase as well?
Not in the research phase. So the research phase, wide open, just kind of trying to suck everything up at once. And I had a professor at USC called Steve Ross, who said this is called surrounding the project. We would just sort of, you just kind of grab everything and see what sticks, and really trying not to be overdetermined. But then as I got into it and really got in, you know, lost in it, and this is, I'm talking like halfway through even writing the book, then I found out what it was about, and that what I was trying to say and what the genre was. I've had 2 books, and I'm on my 3rd, and I've so far had 2, you know, very long days of being on the couch in a fetal position, not knowing what this thing is about, how I'm going to end it, and where it's going. And I think that there's like, I've heard there's a crisis with every book where you're just like, what is this? And so that finding voice, that finding genre only happened through the writing. And certainly, yeah, the research was I think the most fun, because it's like, you can just kind of, nobody's watching, right? You just do your thing, you read, you can get very carried away, and it can take years. But that's, to me, is the real joy of the whole process, is the research. Finding, you know, the guy who ran the mines kept a diary of like every single thing he said to Napoleon. I was like, this, it's like gold, like a very nerdy gold, right? A very esoteric, nerdy version of gold. But for me, that's my gold, is like to find like a 200-year-old diary. So.
That's when you know you're on the right project too, I think.
Right.
When something like that is so exciting to you that it's just, you can't leave it alone.
No one else in the world would find that exciting.
Okay, so Sarah also has 2 more questions. So first of all, what did the Albans write about him? So you may have just been speaking about that. And second of all, did his health improve during the months in exile?
Oh, that's... People did remark that he looked better, and he had more energy, even during like the sailing, like from the French mainland over to Elba, he had kind of transformed. Now, whether that was performance, again, this knowledge that he's sort of under inspection at a much closer range or not, but certainly from an outward appearance, it did seem that it was restorative. And, you know, there are worse places to be than this little island in Tuscany for the health. I mean, the weather was good, and he was very active. So I think, yeah, that's a good point. And that leads to the question of why he left, because he was, by all accounts, on a day-to-day basis, quite well set up and certainly safe. You know, he was always worried about assassins, and there were certain scares of people that were believed to be assassins, but he was kind of relatively safe, maybe safer than he had ever been in his life. And I think that did improve his mental and physical health. As far as what the Albans wrote, you're right that my main source was this guy named Pons, who ran the mines, who was a sort of interlocutor between the local population and the palace, let's say. And so he was my best source of what the locals were getting upset about. I think that here's the kind of answer to your question of what would I maybe go back and visit. If I could do this again, I would spend way more time looking for precisely those sources, because I think that I didn't do as good a job on what the Albans were thinking and how they were reacting as I could have. That to me is the missing piece. That I think there should have been more of that.
Absolutely. I think that's probably a really common concern as we continue to think through post-colonial discourse as well, that we really need those voices in these narratives. But
I had this is like, I'm always talking about my professors, but I had another professor, undergrad, who called me out. He was a socialist historian. He said, where are the Albans?
Yeah.
And I didn't find the sources. And he said, well, you weren't looking hard enough. And like,
that's
so
the challenge.
There's always more to do.
Yeah. Okay, the next question is from Claudette, and she asks, what was one of your most exciting discoveries as you were writing?
It was very weird. I happened upon Airbnb, as you know, people do when they're kind of going to a different place. One of the ways to do it, found this really lovely little spot up a hill, and my wife and I were there for a while. And this is on a little town called Porto Azzurro, which is the south of Elba. And there is this huge prison. It's a maximum security prison. And it's like the most beautiful prison in the world, probably, because it overlooks these crashing waves, but it's a scary place, and it looms over this whole city. It turns out that Napoleon was there for a couple nights, because back in his time it was a stable there was horses, stables, and he was traveling there, hiding out from a would-be assassin, and they put him up there for a couple nights. And I thought, well, that's cool. It'd be interesting to see that. And I think I mentioned that to the woman whose Airbnb we were staying with, and she knew everyone on the island. She said, oh, so-and-so is the warden of the prison. I'll get you inside. And so that was like, then I am inside a Supermax prison, and I can like barely go in an elevator. Like, I don't really like to be in confined spaces, but I got to tour this prison ground because of the connection. And at one point I was walking with this warden, and as I said, my Italian's not great, but I said something like, it's so weird to be here, because of this, like Napoleon was there a couple nights 200 years ago. And he said, and we're looking at this vista, and he said, you're writing a book about Napoleon, you should see what he sees. And, the whole book, and I had kind of mentioned it at that point, it was really about ways of seeing and being seen and display. And here was somebody who kind of like instinctively, or maybe this is me seeing things in the universe resonating with my project and being totally self-absorbed. But I thought that, this was a kind of great connection of like, it totally is about all the different viewpoints on this island. And it was just eerie. It was like so weird to be there. So that was like that was definitely like these things that just happen by chance, chance discoveries.
Yeah. It's kind of an incredible confirmation of where you were headed, and sort of something that was handed to you that was so not anticipated. Well, we have a couple more minutes here if anybody has any last questions. I didn't see any others come in quite yet, but in the meantime, as we wait for any potential last questions, I might ask you, because this has become sort of a tradition with some of these virtual events, if you have any book recommendations for all of our book lovers in the audience.
Well, I happen to be.
You happen to be by your bookshelf.
Happen to be by my office bookshelf. I'll just grab, because I keep them sort of, I know what I've read recently. So these are a couple that I've read. People will indulge me because I love recommending books. This is Zadie Smith's Feel Free. Zadie Smith, certainly not a name that is unknown, but this is a book of essays. And I think that maybe what's
I'll
less—
just do this for nice
right?
effect
I have mine right there too. And that brings me to my thought on Zadie Smith is that as wonderful as her novels are, her essays and her nonfiction are, I think, even better. I think she is just the finest essayist of our generation, of our time. And it's such a nice book to read when you're kind of stuck, because it's so wide ranging. She goes on all sorts of tangents, and she's writing about Joni Mitchell and Martin Buber and Justin Bieber and all sorts of weird and wonderful things. So it's a wonderful wide ranging book. And then this one wins for, I don't know if you can see it. I still don't know what color the cover is. I'm colorblind. It's this weird cover that changes cover. It's a beautiful cover, I think. It's called The Largesse of the Sea Maiden, Dennis Johnson. The late Dennis Johnson, who's often called a writer's writer, in that, supposedly doesn't have maybe as wide an audience as he should, but is such a fine craftsman, and as multiple award winner. But this book, it's a book of short stories, and I think it's for everyone. I think it's very sad. It's death haunted, and I think he knew that he had liver cancer. I think he knew he was on his way out when he was finishing it. But it's incredibly moving and beautiful book. So Dennis Johnson, any of his stuff is great.
Yeah, thank you for both of those.
I could go on. I mean, I won't, but I love recommending books.
Another hour sort of book talk with you. Yeah. We would all love that. But for now, I think we'll take one final question here from Jennifer. So this is the perfect question to wrap up on, I think, sort of forward looking. Right. What is your next project?
So my next project, which, as you mentioned, would have been quite lovely to have been doing a month of it in Paris as a guest, a fellow of the American Library in Paris during its centennial year, but to be postponed. I think you once referred to me as the visiting fellow in exile, which I think I did on my business cards. So the project is, the next book is about Kiki de Montparnasse and Man Ray. And so Kiki de Montparnasse was, in her day, the 1920s, a very, very well-known artist model and artist and singer and performer and cabaret performer, we'll say, and painter, and kind of this multi-hyphenate artist who was living with Man Ray in Montparnasse for 6 or 7 years, during which he was the lesser known artist, and they made a very, if you look up those names, Kiki and Man Ray, you'll see some iconic images. And so it's looking at the creation of those images, looking at their time together, and trying to explore, and again, this is me, I think, because I'm sort of not finished, although I should be, on my way to finishing, trying to explore the tricky relationship between artist and muse, and who gets that title and why, and who do we remember and why, and the kind of power imbalances inherent in that. And also just maybe, hopefully it will be, speaking of genres, somewhat of a complicated love story as well, but another work of narrative nonfiction. Great.
Well, thank you again, Mark, for this wonderful conversation. I'm sure all of us are really eager to dive into the book if we haven't yet read it. So it was a wonderful preview.
Thank you so much.
Oh, it's nice. Some people are submitting their clap icons,
oh,
which is very lovely. It's sort of strange, but lovely.
It's nice.
And again, yeah, it was just a pleasure to host you, Mark. You are forever our visiting fellow in exile. Well, I hope only maybe for this summer. I hope maybe to see you in person before too long. And I'm really looking forward to planning those details and planning those other events. And as far as everybody else, I wanted to mention that we do have many more evenings with an author that are coming up. Our season will end on July 15th. So everything is up on our website. On the calendar, you can go and check out other events you might be interested in, and please do go ahead and sign up so that you can get the Zoom link. I wanted to mention that tomorrow we'll be joined by Jean Beeman and Ina Siddiqui for a conversation about racial inequalities in France and the US. And next week we have events on At Jay's Paris with Emilio Williams on Tuesday. And then the New Parisienne, which is by a new book by Lindsay Tremuta. It's going to be released in July now. The release was postponed because of COVID. And she'll be in conversation with Thomas Chatterton Williams. So please do sign up for those events if you're interested. And as many of you know who do come to our events in person, at the library, we welcome donations of 10 euros for events. And so if you do feel that you want to donate or support the library, please do follow the link that I sent in my email, and that will guide you to the page where you can enter any amount you might feel like donating. And we really appreciate your support. Thank you so much, Mark.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Lovely to see you. Cheers.
Take care.
Be well. Bye.